Hello everyone, and welcome to the 6th installment of our series. Today we're going to be discussing the 7th century, so that's essentially the year 700 BC to 601 BC. This is going to be a fairly Near East heavy session, since a lot of the information of what's going on in the world comes to us from the Near East. This is essentially the height of the Assyrian Empire, who would essentially be displaced by the Medes, the Babylonians, and the Scythians. But before that, let's see what's going on in their world. Okay, so let's talk about Sennacherib. Sennacherib was a king of Assyria. His dates are 705 BC to 681 BC. He was placed in charge of the Assyrian Empire while his father, Sargon II, was on campaign. So this all essentially was part of what historians call today the Syro-Ephraimite crisis. The Syro-Ephraimite War took place during the 8th century BC, when Assyria was a great regional power already, and the smaller nations of Syria, which sometimes we call Aram, this is where the word Aramaic comes from. So these smaller nations, and including the northern kingdom of Israel, which is often called Ephraim because of the main tribe, they formed a coalition in defense against an oncoming threat. They had been tributary nations to Assyria, and they finally decided to break away. So the kingdom of Judah, which at the time had been under King Ahaz, this is Hezekiah's father, he refused to join the coalition. He knew essentially that if he sold himself out to foreign rulers, that they would make this practice of exclusive, monotheistic, temple-oriented worship very difficult, as they were pagans. They had many gods. So, the coalition of Syria and northern Israel attempted to depose Ahaz through an invasion. This is where Ahaz called out to Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria for help. The Assyrians defended Judah, conquering northern Israel, Syria, and the Philistines, but the post-war alliance only brought more trouble for Ahaz. Ahaz had to pay a tribute to Tiglath-Pileser III with treasures from the temple and from the royal treasury. Ahaz had built idols of Assyrian gods in Judah to find new favor with his ally, and this sets up the scene for Hezekiah. So in 701 BC, there was a rebellion that broke out in Judah, and it was backed by Assyria's two principal enemies, Babylonia and Egypt. So the king at the time of this event in Judah was King Hezekiah. So according to the Bible, King Hezekiah, whose dates are traditionally 715 to 686 BC, Hezekiah witnessed the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel by the Assyrians under Sargon II in 720 BC. This was Sennacherib, the king who we're talking about's father. Hezekiah eventually became king of Judah during the invasion and siege of Jerusalem by Sennacherib in 701 BC. He enacted sweeping religious reforms, and a big part of this was removing the worship of foreign deities from the temple in Jerusalem. The temple had been closed under the king Ahaz. Hezekiah restored the worship of Yahweh, the God of Israel, And he did this in accordance with the Torah. Now, this is important. We had a period of syncretism between Phoenician and Hebrew religion, and that was violently swept out of the kingdom. Hezekiah would do much of the bureaucratic work once all of these foreign priests and foreign gods and idols and Asherahs in the mountains had been done away with. So between the death of the Assyrian king Sargon II and the succession of his son Sennacherib, Hezekiah wanted to throw off his subservience to the Assyrian king. Usually in history, periods of succession are the most turbulent and therefore are the best times to start a rebellion. So Hezekiah ceased to pay the tribute that had been imposed on his father Ahaz, and he rebelled against the king of Assyria. Hezekiah then entered into a mutual protection pact, let's say, with Egypt. So in response to this rebellion, Sennacherib mustered up an army with all of his chariots and his archers, and he sacked a number of cities in Judah. He laid siege to Jerusalem, but soon he returned to Nineveh, with Jerusalem not having been sacked, in order to put down an attempted coup. So, like I said, succession periods or interregnum periods are the best times to start a revolt. So, according to the Bible, Sennacherib withdrew his army because, quote, the angel of Yahweh went out and put to death 185,000 soldiers in the Assyrian camp. That's from 2 Kings 19:35. This is an embellishment. We see from Assyrian records that the reason they ran away was not because they were so horrendously crushed, but because they had to deal with a rebellion back home. Now, during this whole affair, King Hezekiah of Judah expected the Egyptians to come to his aid. They didn't. Hezekiah had to face the invasion of Judah by Sennacherib alone. The record of this is in 2 Kings 18:13-16. So it's during this period, under the harsh reign of Sennacherib, that Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, is regarded as the highest symbol of tyranny and bloody suppression in the Near East. The Assyrians destroy Babylon, and they divert the Euphrates to cover over the site of the city. This is how thoroughly they wanted to destroy this city-state that was a thorn in their side. Eventually, the Assyrians destroy Memphis and Thebes in Egypt, and it's during this period that we have the reign of Manasseh. Manasseh would be the first king of Judah who wouldn't have any direct experience with the northern kingdom of Israel, as they had been destroyed by the Assyrians in 720 BC, and much of its population had been deported. So Manasseh's dates as ruler are 687 to 643 BC. He's the son of Hezekiah, who we just looked at. Manasseh would reinstitute pagan worship in Judah, in the temple, and reverse most of the religious reforms that had been made by Hezekiah. Manasseh, for this reason, is severely condemned in the Deuteronomic histories. Okay, so let's stop for a second and look at some other things that are going on in the area and in the world, because we could spend all our time looking at politics, and as we know, this is only one facet of history. We'll come back to this story once we've done our rounds through the cultural sphere of things. So, during this period, this 7th century BC, Egyptian hieroglyphs are adapted to demotic script. The word demotic comes from the Greek word demotikos, which means popular, and this was the ancient Egyptian script derived from northern forms of hieratic used in the Nile Delta. This marks the late period of Egyptian writing, and it also is the script which precedes Coptic. This term was first used by Herodotus to distinguish it from hieratic and hieroglyphic scripts. Now, we shouldn't confuse this with Demotic Greek, which is the modern vernacular form of Greek. So, I should mention that Demotic was used, in this period at least, for mainly administrative, legal, and commercial texts, and hieroglyphs, or hieratic, was still reserved for other texts, like religious texts. The library at Nineveh, which we discussed as the capital of the Assyrian Empire, contains poetry, educational texts, instructions for grammatical translation of Sumerian texts into Semitic languages. It's a veritable hub of cultural exchange. In China, we see the beginning of the second period of Chinese literature, and this will run down to 200 BC. Meanwhile, the Indian Vedas, that great collection of religious, philosophical, and educational writings, is now complete. Remember, this was an oral tradition that was redacted for centuries and then finally written down in this period. In India, we have the Brahmanic religion, the religion of the priest class, defining 6 stages of the transmigration of the soul. The transmigration of the soul, the belief in reincarnation, that the body dies but the soul returns endlessly on the wheel of samsara, whether as insect or god or man, depending on the karma of the soul, its collective action, the sum of its actions. This belief is now firmly entrenched and defined. This would have massive ramifications in Greece through the Orphic and Pythagorean cults, the Dionysian religion, which surely I will talk more about later. This would have massive implications on the life of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, who is soon to arrive on the scene to strip down Hinduism for export. The transmigration of the soul would also factor very, very deeply into Judaic mysticism, such as Kabbalah, which wouldn't really be formally conglomerated in the way we understand it today until the 13th century, but nevertheless, it also played a tremendous role in Gnosticism and therefore in Christianity. The mystery cults were heavily indebted to the notion of the transmigration of the soul. We'll even see it in Platonic dialogues. Now, in this period, the prophet Jeremiah predicts the fall of Judah. This would ultimately happen in 597 during the first Babylonian deportations, when the royal family was exiled to Babylon, the royal family of Judah. Now, I want to highlight a very important, still to this day, pattern which is central to the conception of Jewish and Hebrew history. There is an archetype at work in the literature of the Old Testament. The archetype is as follows. People are faithful to Yahweh, and then they are unfaithful to Yahweh. They forget about the Torah, they forget about the laws of their ancestors, and the covenants which their forefathers made with the one true God, and therefore Yahweh delivers them into the hands of their enemies. The people repent, and they entreat Yahweh for mercy. He then sends a leader or a champion to deliver them, and this hero delivers the Israelites from oppression and they prosper. But soon again they fall into unfaithfulness, and the cycle is repeated. This is why we call it Israel. It means those who wrestle with God. So this archetype occurs in the book of Judges. It is all about how God raises up the judges to deliver Israel from oppression. Eventually, Saul and David and Solomon would pull Israel out of a mire of un-Deuteronomistic behavior sanctioned by the Deuteronomistic histories, which would be written down much later. This would play out with Ahaz and Hezekiah. Ahaz lets the kingdom fall into pagan hands, and the kingdom is punished as a result. And Hezekiah reverses Ahaz's mistakes. And then Manasseh afterward again falls into league with pagans. And then God raises up an army to destroy them. It's this endless cycle. This cycle is still at work today. At least it is in the minds of those people who inhabit the modern state that is called Israel. They still identify with this cycle of redemption, loss, redemption, loss. Israel is a veritable prodigal son. So the Deuteronomistic histories are an anti-northern polemic in most parts. They are telling us the history of the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern tribe of Judah, centered around Jerusalem, and how Judah is faithful to God, or at least tries to be faithful, and the northern tribes were not, and that is why they were swept away and wiped out by the Assyrians. The Deuteronomistic history is a theologically oriented history of Israel from the time of the entry into Canaan to the destruction of the first temple. The details of this history are still widely debated, but most scholars place the final form of the book of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings in the 6th century BC. This is when it was written. They think it was written during the time of the Babylonian exile, as a means to give one another some form of cultural memory, to get each other out of the captivity that they had fallen into because of their arrogance, because of their trying to strive alone without their ancestral God. They use art as a means of overthrowing oppression. So, according to the Bible, there is a very teleological reason why the northern kingdom of Israel was conquered by the Assyrian monarch, Tiglath-Pileser III, raised up by Yahweh to deliver his justice, thus fulfilling the old pattern set in Judges, of unfaithfulness to God's covenant, leading to one's deliverance into the hands of one's enemies as punishment. So, after King Manasseh, who had screwed up and let idolatry take root in Judah once more, we have the pendulum swing back the other way. This would be with King Josiah. Josiah is credited by most historians with having fostered the atmosphere and then officially established and compiled the most important Hebrew scriptures into what we call the Deuteronomistic histories. Some people call this period the Deuteronomic Reforms. The king himself was set on the task of cleansing the land from idolatry. He encouraged the exclusive worship of Yahweh again and outlawed all forms of worship. So we see this dialectic at work. This constant back and forth struggle between a pure monotheism and a natural syncretism of religion. A religion which is imposed from the top down in order to maintain control, and the religion of the everyday man and woman. There is an alliance at work between mystics and prophets and kings against the natural flow of things. Prophets legitimize kings by anointing them, and in turn, the kings enforce the religions which are espoused by the prophet. So, we've talked a fair deal about the Near East. Let's move westward toward Greece. We're going to have to rewind a little bit in time, but we'll be matched up with the Near East in our chronology by the end of our discussion. Just before getting into Greece, I just want to say a couple more things about what's going on in the Near East. King Sennacherib's garden. It was in Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, in his palace, and it had rare plants and animals. The planting space and irrigation channels for the garden were blasted from rock. So this is a great technological innovation. There is progress in terms of water installations. Jerusalem has a subterranean water tunnel to protect them from sieges. Sennacherib builds an aqueduct. This would be the first of its kind. And Nineveh has bucket wells. King Ashurbanipal's famous library, with over 22,000 clay tablets, covers history, medicine, astronomy, and astrology. The movements of the planets and signs of the zodiac are, by this point, fully written down. The same signs of the zodiac which we use today. These are set in stone, so to speak. There are water clocks in Assyria, and Pharaoh Nekos of Egypt starts a canal between the Nile and the Red Sea. King Sennacherib's mountain climbing is the first mention of alpine sports. Hesiod's poems, Works and Days, which we talked about in some detail last session, mentions cultivation of barley, wheat, legumes, grapes, olives, figs, and also the husbandry of horses, cattle, goats, sheep, and pigs. We have extensive libraries of trade information at Nineveh. These are concerning sales, exchanges, rentals, leases, loans, interest, mortgages. All of these things are already in effect by the Iron Age. Well, I should mention, we are still technically in the Iron Age. We've never left. Perhaps the next age might be, I don't know, the Silicon Age. It certainly won't be the Plastic Age, because we passed peak oil in the 1970s and we require petroleum to make plastics. So if there was a Plastic Age, it's past. So, like I was saying, let's get back to Greece. During this period, between 700 and 600, we get the Second Messenian War, the war between the Spartans and their slaves, the Messenians. We know of annual elections of Areopagites. These are members of a judicial court on the Areopagus in Athens. Now, Areopagus is just a fancy word. It means Ares is rock in Greek, and it's the northwest of the Acropolis in Athens, which is the raised portion of the city which served as its heart and fortress. In classical times beginning around this period, the Areopagus functioned as a high court of appeal for criminal and civil cases. Ares was supposed to have been tried by the gods for the murder of Poseidon's son, and this is the etiological myth given for the foundation of this institution. So, we have annual elections of judicial court members, Areopagites, in Athens in this period. Solon. We talked about Lycurgus last session. Solon would be the Athenian equivalent of a legendary lawgiver and statesman whose reforms would bring Greece out of the so-called Dark Ages and into the height of its classical age. Solon's dates are traditionally 640 to 560 BC. Callinus, the earliest known Greek lyricist, comes from this period. His battle hymn was preserved. Archilochus, a Greek lyricist and author of fables, raises iambic poetry to the status of high art. Before this, all poems were in dactylic hexameter for the most part. Most kings in their courts, when they listened to poetry, they listened to bards or rhapsodes singing in dactylic hexameter. This sort of rhythm. This is from the opening lines of the Odyssey. Andra moyenne pe musa polytra ponhos malapola plankte e petroiesi erontoliethron e persen polon d'antroponi denastea kaino negno pola dogen ponto patenalge ahon katatumon ar numenos ein te psyken kai noston et airon. Alud hos et arus erus atohi emenosper, auton gar svetereisin atastaliesin olonto, nebioi, hoi catabus uperionos elioio, estion, autarotoisin afeibeto nostimon emar, ton amoten getea, tugater dios, epecaemin. So this is called dactylic hexameter, and the reason it's named this is a dactyl in Greek means a finger. A finger is divided into 3 parts: long, short, short. So the Alcaic stanza, named after Alcaeus, a lyric poet from Mytilene on the island of Lesbos, was a totally new style of rhythm, and it began to take popularity. So we have the Alcaic stanza and the Sapphic stanza, named after Sappho, as 2 important forms of classical poetry. This is the next step after the Homeric poetry of the so-called Dark Ages. A good example in English of one of these alchaic stanzas is by Tennyson concerning John Milton, the author of Paradise Lost. He sings, "O mighty-mouthed inventor of harmonies, O skilled to sing of time or eternity, God-gifted organ voice of England, Milton, a name to resound for ages." So, in the meantime, Tyrtaeus and Mimnermus, Greek poets, write elegies. They write love songs and songs of war. Stesichorus of Sicily is known as the creator of the heroic ballad. The first Doric columns. You may have remember learning the 3 different columns in art school. The Doric column begins in the Peloponnese in this period. Stone architecture and monumental sculptures begin in Greece. Also colored sketches. We get the first Ionic columns on Samos. Limestone and marble are used in the construction of temples. The design of houses becomes more ornate. The Acropolis in Athens is a major site. It is Doric in style, and it has life-size sculptures of women, which are called kore statues, or kouros if they're boys. The flute and the lyre are popular as accompanying instruments in poetry. The 7-stringed lyre is introduced. Terpander writes for a solo voice with instruments. So all the while this is happening, there is a foundation of the city of Ostia near Rome, which would eventually become Rome's port city. It was founded by the Etruscans in this period. Ornamental weaving becomes a great activity in Greece for women. I would go so far as to argue that weaving was the weapon used against women in order to keep them in the house. It is extremely tedious, it takes an extremely long amount of time, and the progress is quite measurable. If you're not doing it, it doesn't get done. So it's a good way to keep tabs on someone. Set them in front of a loom and make them weave. They won't be doing much else if they've been put in charge of clothing the entire family. So in this period, coinage, made of a gold and silver alloy called electrum, first appears in Lydia. This would have massive ramifications. The colonization of the wider Mediterranean by Greeks is still happening in this period. Paestum in southern Italy and Massilia in southern France, modern-day Marseille, are founded around the year 600. Thales of Miletus, the great Greek philosopher, his dates are 624 to 545 BC. He was one of the so-called 7 sages of Greece, and Aristotle regarded him as the first philosopher in the Greek tradition, despite being from Asia Minor. Remember, Greek as a language and an ethnicity was not unified, and it was spread very widely, especially on the western coast of Anatolia. So Aristotle tells us about Thales' hypothesis about the originating principle, the primordial substance from which all other things stemmed. Thales believed that this substance was water. Now, later Heraclitus would come, and he would claim it was fire and void. There would be many theories for originating principles, and these would start up around this period, philosophizing about what the primal substance, the prima materia of the universe was. Of course, now we know that it is energy. And in this sense, Heraclitus is not terribly wrong to believe that fire is the primordial substance. But, in a way, Thales, too, is right. We would not have life on Earth were it not for water. All of these men were highly, highly perceptive, and it doesn't matter which one of them is more similar to the modern definition of science. They contributed an immense amount of knowledge to humanity's cosmology. So, an interesting fact is concerning graffiti, and graffiti in Nubia, no less, made by Greek soldiers. These were mercenaries hired in Egypt. Their graffiti shows a fairly good elementary education, even for mercenary soldiers. Education was broadly accessible within Greek society in this period. This in part explains the explosion of love for poetry and the diversification of poetic forms that occurred during this period. Okay, so now that we've spoken a bit about what's going on in Greece, in some fairly sketchy detail, I'm going to move on to talk about Persia, which would be one of the largest empires the world had seen up until this point, and it would ultimately link Greece back up with the Near East, with which it had not really been totally connected. I don't want to say that there was not some exchange of cultural ideas or goods, but for the most part, around the time of the Bronze Age collapse, there was an abscission. Greeks were cut off from the Near East, and the Far East for that matter. The Persian Empire would be the power to link up East and West once again. This all begins around the time a Chaldean general, Nabopolassar, seizes the Babylonian throne, the city-state of Babylonia, and declares independence from Assyria. This created some instability, which was then capitalized on by the Medes and the Scythians, who were tribal, nomadic, horseback archers. They lived lives very similar to the Huns and the Mongols and the Tatars, a very rough steppe life, raised in the saddle. So the Babylonians, the Medes, and the Scythians essentially tore apart the Assyrian Empire. They destroyed Nineveh, and the pieces which had made up the Assyrian Empire were divided among its conquerors. So here's where we get the rise of the Neo-Babylonians. These are the Babylonians who would take Israel into captivity. Okay, so moving on. I want to make a general statement about the Middle East and why we spend so much attention looking at it. It's not as if there is no action going on the periphery. Life was just as lively in Africa and in Asia, in the Americas. But why the Middle East? The Middle East was the birthplace of civilization and the graveyard of empires. Now, it was the birthplace of civilization on account of climactic changes which drove people to fork over their personal liberties, a concept which didn't even exist in the Near East. For example, the Egyptians have no word for freedom. Everyone was a slave to the king. This was obvious insofar as even the second in command in most Near Eastern empires was required to crawl on his face toward the king. So we have people forking over personal liberties in order to be protected, in order to be fed. And this was brought about by climatic changes, global warming, the drying up of the areas. Irrigation was required in order to feed the amount of people that were living in the area. And works of irrigation, these sorts of public works projects, can't be undertaken on a personal basis. So, the Near East is the birthplace of civilization. It is a crucible of conflict because it is the land where 3 major continents meet, and it is the graveyard of empires for that very same reason. Nature abhors a vacuum. If a power vacuum presents itself, it is very, very quickly filled up by a competing power. This is the principle of correspondence at work, the idea as above, so below. Remember that these are flows of energy at work. Literal energy that comes down from the sun, that takes form as plant material on the face of the earth, and then provides us with calories. Heat. If you have a container, and you suck all the air out of it, depending on how that container is, it will shatter. If it doesn't shatter, it will remain empty, and the second even the slightest little opening is made in that container, air will violently rush in to fill it. Nature abhors a vacuum, both on the scale of a container emptied of air, or on the scale of a civilization in its death throes. Dealing with the problem of empire is like dealing with a hydra. You cut off one head, and many heads sprout from the wound. So as we see where we are in our chronology, the minute Assyria shows any weakness, and they were ruthless, they were masters of terrorism. Nineveh was decorated with the bodies of traitors, mutilated in all sorts of extremely creative ways, impaled on posts, skinned alive, rubbed down with salt. The minute any weakness was sensed, cultures which stood on the periphery swept in to fill that power vacuum. Now, this dynamic, surely it was noticed earlier, but the great historian Ibn Khaldun, an Arabic historian from the late Middle Ages, he wrote about this perpetual conflict between the core and the periphery. And we're going to see this again and again and again as yesterday's barbarians become today's elite. There is always a core and a periphery. If you want to use these rather anachronistic terms, there is always a first world and a third world. And the trend in history is that the ruling upper crust within the so-called first world, within the civilized core, is ephemeral. All it takes is a group of marauding horsemen to sweep in and clean up house. They replace the elite. Things on the ground level to the average peasant, to the average merchant, things don't change much for them. But for the ruling elite, change is swift and violent. And it always comes from the periphery. It doesn't matter if it's Baghdad in the Middle Ages being sacked by the Mongols. It doesn't matter if it's Rome collapsing under the weight of Germanic immigration. It doesn't matter if it's Assyria collapsing under the weight of invasion by the Scythians and the Babylonians and the Medes. There is this constant dynamic of core versus periphery, of local aristocracies having their time in the sun and then being violently replaced the minute that they fall into any sort of decadence and lose touch with the way they got that power to begin with. And this is why the elite are so ruthless. Many have studied history and they know this. They know the second that they relax the reins of power, that the periphery will sweep in to replace them. This dynamic was in existence in the year 3000 BC, and it is in existence now. If any revolution is to come to change the powers that be in our world, it's not coming from the inside out. We are too sedated. Our masters have made us too comfortable and too complacent. We have too much to lose. Revolution is coming from over the border. It's coming from the outside. Things will not be as they have always been. Eventually, poverty reaches a boiling point, and those people at the periphery of the action, at the periphery of wealth, at the periphery of power, at the periphery of luxury, eventually they come banging at the gates. This will happen to us. To those of us, at least, who live in North America, in Europe, in the wealthier nations, as we squander our lives in excess and luxury, and those people who live in the periphery, who are just as human as us, take note of this. They will come violently. This is not necessarily something to fear, however, if you live honestly, if you shy away from power, from domination. This is the message in Hesiod's Works and Days. This is the message in the book of Ecclesiastes. There is wisdom in abstaining from power, because a life of power is a short one. It is also a life of fear, of constantly checking your back. So, live simply. Know that the universe is governed by principles which I'm going to list in a second. Know that it is governed by laws, and that just because things seem different now, because of technology, because of advances in science, because of the calcification of borders and militaries, national interests, just because of this, don't assume that the principles which govern the universe are no longer in effect. Live simply and honestly in the light of these principles. This is what the book of Ecclesiastes is about. Watch your ambition, because it will drive you into a world of fear. So, in closing, I want to discuss the 7 Hermetic principles which govern the universe. I come back to these a lot, and these weren't set down until the 20th century. Though they are Hermetic principles, they were not put on paper until very recently, and this was done in the spirit of Hermeticism, not out of some principles which were found in the old Corpus Hermeticum from the 2nd century AD. So let's take a look at these principles, because they will always be relevant in our study of history. The first principle is the principle of mentalism. This is the idea that all is mind, that there is nothing independent of our relationship to the all. Everything is relative. Consciousness is what defines a thing. The sophist Protagoras said, man is the measure of all things. What this means is, let's say, for example, you take a spoon. Now you give me the qualities of that spoon. You say, it's shiny, it's smooth, it is malleable. But these are qualities that are only relative to you. Were you to be 1,000th of the size that you are, the spoon would probably not be smooth. It might appear rough. And as a result, it might lose its luster. It might lose its shine. Its malleability is relative to your strength. So, everything, all qualities that we perceive are relative to the one perceiving it. The second principle is the principle of correspondence, which we just discussed. As above, so below. This is the idea that the universe is self-similar across scales, that the way the universe is governed in the microcosm, in the body of man, is the same way that the macrocosm, that the Milky Way and the universe itself, in the big sense of the term, is governed. It's the same laws that govern all of these things. The universe is self-similar across scales. Regardless of what plane you're existing on, the same rules apply. The third principle is the principle of vibration. This is the idea that nothing rests and everything is constantly in flux. Heraclitus, who we discussed earlier in very brief detail, said, Panta re, everything flows. You never step in the same river twice. Everything is in motion. Science confirms this. All matter is energy at a slow vibration. If we were small enough, we could slip through the cracks. The principle of vibration also leads us to the next principle, which is the principle of polarity. The principle of on and offness. The idea that everything is dual. Everything has poles. There are eccentric and there are concentric. There is an on symbol and an off symbol. Now, usually we think of things in terms of hot and cold, or on and off, or love and fear. But one of the ends of these polarities is actually just illusory. There is no such thing as cold. It only exists in our perception. There is really just heat and the absence of it. So in all polarities, know that one side of the polarity is off, is nothing, is zero, and all things must be reconciled toward this nothingness. And there is nothing but many shades of gray between the black and the white. The next is the principle of rhythm. This ties into these last two principles. I mean, ultimately, all of these principles lock into one another very neatly and require one another to function. We can apply this to what we were just saying about the core and the periphery. Everything flows out and in. Everything has its tides. Empires rise and empires fall. You are born and you die. You come in and out of life, in and out of consciousness. All of this has a rhythm. Everything swings like a pendulum. This is how life itself proceeds. The sixth principle is the principle of cause and effect. And this is the idea that every cause has its effect, and every effect has its cause. Things happen in accordance with universal law, and concepts like luck, chance, are illusions. These are just names for laws which are not recognized. Nothing just happens. Just is the dirtiest word in the English language. There's no such thing as chance. There are only laws which are unperceived at work. Lastly, there is the principle of gender. The idea that gender is in everything. It's in our chromosomes, it's in plants, it's in animals. Everything has a masculine principle and a feminine principle. These aren't male and female, these are masculine and feminine. There is a difference. Both males and females embody masculine and feminine principles. This ties into the principle of polarity. This occurs not only on the physical plane, but also on the mental plane. This is where you get this concept of a left brain and a right brain, of an analytical brain and an emotional brain. These are the principles of gender at work. And then on the spiritual plane as well. The Kabbalists were very fond of categorizing the emanations of God into a pillar of severity, a feminine pillar, the feminine side of the mind of God, and the pillar of mercy, the masculine side, the right hand. So, we'll come back to this. These principles will constantly be popping in and out of our discussions. This is really the Hermetic character of the history that I'm giving, that I'm making reference to these Hermetic principles in history. So study them carefully and try to see them at work, both in the past and today. This has been the Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History, and I'm your host, Dan Attrell. Thank you.